Orion did not hire people. He collected useful tools. Cassia, designated as Candidate 734, was a puzzle he could not solve. Her background file was pristine, which in his world meant it was an expert fabrication. She had survived his process. This included 3 days of intense psychological screening and 22 hours of polygraph questioning focused entirely on her loyalty and motives. She also endured 4 brutal physical aptitude trials presented as simple stress evaluations. She passed every single test, even outperforming his own head of security on the stress management exercises. Now, she stood on the other side of the massive black glass desk in his penthouse office, looking entirely composed. The tailored suit she wore cost a fraction of the watch on Orion's wrist, but she made it look far more valuable. She was unnervingly calm. Orion leaned forward in his massive leather chair, and the sound it made was a heavy, deliberate warning in the silent, heavily secured room. "I am told you managed the stress test quite well," Orion said. His voice was a low, smooth rumble intended to grate on a person's nerves. "I manage stress. Stress in this house is not a classroom drill, Cassia. It is the very architecture." He made a vague motion toward the sprawling city skyline visible through the reinforced window. Far below them, the city was a network of uncaring lights. Above them, there was only the cold quiet of high-level surveillance and his complete control. He had watched countless people crumble right in this very room. Fear almost always showed itself in sweat, in shaking hands, or in a sudden frantic urge to talk too much. Cassia simply waited. "We discovered a discrepancy in your history," Orion pushed, savoring the dominance of the moment. "A 4-year gap, government files that were completely blacked out." "A personal sabbatical," she answered, her voice level and entirely unmoved by the implied accusation of being a spy. He let out a laugh. The sound was abrupt and sharp, completely without humor. "Sabbatical. The people who come to work for me do not get to take sabbaticals. They simply vanish, and sometimes it is forever." He reached over and picked up a small, brightly colored plastic dinosaur. It was a favorite toy his daughter had left behind during a rare visit to this part of the estate. A small, dark smudge was on its snout. It was blood. It was not a lot, just a faint trace of dried crimson that was barely visible in the light. Cassia's eyes followed the toy's movement. She showed no sign of shock, no hint of moral disgust, only quiet observation. "You are aware of the rules in this place," Orion stated, setting the dinosaur back down on the immaculate glass. "This is not a job. It is a form of exposure. You will witness things, things that you can never forget. My life is filled with danger. By being near me, your life is now deadly." He paused, waiting for the usual sign of retreat, that flicker of panic, the dawning realization that the incredible salary was not worth the profound physical danger of sharing his air. Cassia did not back away from him. She moved toward the desk. She rounded the corner with a movement that was smooth and economical. She was not approaching her new boss. She was approaching the piece of evidence. She lifted the small plastic dinosaur. Her long fingers expertly wiped the faint smear of blood away with a tissue she produced from an inside pocket of her jacket. She held the newly cleaned toy with care. Then, she looked straight at Orion. Her eyes were a deep, unwavering gray, completely free of the fear or the twisted curiosity he typically saw in people. "They did warn me your world was overwhelming," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the enormous room. "Too violent, too controlled for anyone on the outside." She placed the dinosaur back in its exact spot, now a little cleaner, a little safer. "I am capable of handling it all." Orion remained motionless for a long moment. He was a hunter who had just been sized up by something with equally sharp teeth. He had presented the danger, the terms, the unspoken threat. He had anticipated her submission. Instead, he received competence. He gave her the job immediately. He had to find out what she truly was. Cassia adapted to the new position perfectly, almost too perfectly. The estate was a fortress that was cleverly disguised as a luxury home. It had concrete walls thicker than the vaults in a bank. Every door had a biometric scanner. Armed patrols made their rounds every single hour. And yet, Cassia moved through it all as if she belonged there, skillfully navigating the internal dynamics between the staff, the cooks, the drivers, and the personal security team with a quiet sense of authority. She never tried to gain favor with anyone. She commanded respect simply by being professionally neutral. Orion observed her constantly. He monitored his integrated surveillance network more diligently than he watched the stock market. His daughter, Ara, was the center of his universe. Ara had managed to get the last 4 nannies fired, either through intense temper tantrums or a stubborn refusal to connect with them. Ara, however, had accepted Cassia from the very first day. He watched Cassia in the sunroom, reading a book to Ara. The sunlight highlighted the sharp line of her jaw. She was completely focused and attentive, but she always maintained a situational awareness that made him uneasy. She registered every single sound from outside the protected room, yet the rhythm of her voice never wavered. One afternoon, Orion entered the room without any warning. He hoped to catch her unprepared, to finally see a crack in her composure. He found Cassia supervising Ara's puzzle time. "The security report for the West Wing was compromised this morning," Orion declared, his eyes fixed on her hands. Cassia did not even look up from helping Ara find a missing puzzle piece that was shaped like a castle turret. "That wing has exposure to the public road. It was always the most vulnerable point." Her response was dry and factual, showing no pretended concern for his issues. There was no clumsy effort to flatter him. "And how would you know this?" "I studied the architectural blueprints before I signed the non-disclosure agreement," she replied matter-of-factly. "A good nanny always knows the escape routes before the child does." A cold feeling settled deep in Orion's stomach. This was not professional diligence. This was tactical analysis. He then noticed a small, cherished wooden toy car. It appeared heavy and dense. He reached for it, pretending to inspect its base casually. "Ara loves this one," he murmured. "She does," Cassia concurred, her tone still completely mild. "But it sometimes vibrates. We should probably check the battery." Orion's fingers located the tiny, almost invisible seam on the bottom of the car's frame. It was not a battery compartment. It was constructed to conceal something else entirely, something digital and very expensive. It was a specialized tracking device, a high-end military model built to send location and audio signals through thick shielding. He did not have to open it to be certain. He looked directly at Cassia. She met his stare without flinching. She offered no confession. She made no accusation. She simply knew. And he knew that she knew. The unspoken understanding passed between them, thick and heavy. "I discovered the listening device that someone planted. I know what you are really searching for." "A gift from an old business associate," Orion lied with practiced ease. "I should have it properly disposed of." "It is always best to be thorough," Cassia said, taking the car and placing it on a high shelf far out of Ara's reach. "You can never be sure who might be listening." Orion began asking Cassia to join him for dinner. It was not out of any fondness, but to watch her under intense and prolonged examination, away from the simple data of the security cameras. The dinners were silent events, held in his private dining room, watched over by portraits of his deceased syndicate ancestors. Ara was always sound asleep. One evening, their conversation turned to the true price of maintaining control. "Most people believe power is about taking whatever you desire," Orion reflected, swirling the deep red wine in his glass. "They are mistaken. Real power is about protecting what you currently possess, and that demands constant, brutal vigilance." Cassia ate her meal slowly, with methodical precision. "Vigilance can be exhausting," she noted. "Exhausting, of course, but essential. I do not trust anyone who has not proven they are willing to sacrifice absolutely everything." "Sacrifice is the easy part," Cassia countered, finally raising her eyes to meet his. "The truly difficult part is living with the consequences of that sacrifice." Orion paused his motion. This was not the conversation of a nanny. This was the language of someone who had been in the operational field. Tell me, what did you sacrifice, Cassia, during that sabbatical of yours? He inquired, leaning back in his chair. A tiny hesitation followed, the only genuine flaw he had ever seen in her composure. My capacity for being surprised, she answered at last. The reply was incredibly effective. It hinted at a past too grim for surprises, a point where trauma and violence had reached their limit. Orion smiled, a brief flash of teeth that almost never reached his eyes. Surprise is what gets you killed in this place. You understand that, do you not? That is the reason you are still alive. The underlying message was unmistakable. I am aware that you are hiding something deadly. I am simply waiting for you to reveal it. The pressure from outside forces began to increase. The Hydra, a rival syndicate known for their precise, targeted assassinations, was becoming more aggressive. The threats were evolving from simple territory conflicts into direct personal attacks. The atmosphere inside the compound grew as tense as a razor wire fence. The number of security details was doubled. Orion stopped sleeping for more than 4 hours each night. He discovered Cassia awake at 3 o'clock one morning, not watching television, but standing silently beside Ara's crib. She was not checking on the child. She was assessing the room. Her hand was resting near a pane of reinforced window glass. Can't sleep? Orion asked, emerging from the deep shadows of the hallway. I sleep when the threat level is no longer critical, she answered without turning around. Tonight, it feels like purple. Purple? The color of a deep breach. Not merely an assault on the perimeter, but something that is already inside. Orion moved across the large room. He stood near enough to catch the faint, clean fragrance of her soap, near enough to feel the warmth coming from her body. The closeness was intentional. He was evaluating her physical response to his power, to his sheer presence. You speak as if you are familiar with infiltration, he murmured. I am familiar with how the human mind operates under extreme pressure. When the walls become too thick, people begin to search for the thinnest spots. And where is the thinnest spot in this entire fortress, Cassia? She finally turned to face him, their faces now just inches from each other. The tension between them was not romantic. It was purely kinetic, like two loaded weapons aimed at one another. You, she said, and her voice was sharp, you are the vulnerability. The strongest fortress means nothing if the person inside is already broken. Orion flinched, not from insult, but from the cold shock of recognition. She saw the absolute truth of his situation, the crushing weight of his power that no one else dared to speak of. He moved back, reclaiming the space and his composure. Then your responsibilities have increased, he commanded. You need to shield that vulnerability. Cassia's lips barely moved as she spoke. I told you, I can bear all of it. He left her standing there, her gaze fixed on the guarded night. He was fully aware he was courting danger, but the pure thrill of watching her function, of seeing her defy the very concept of fear, was becoming vital to him. He was already dependent on her unbreakable will. He immediately ordered a deep probe into her history, giving his security chief, Marcus, the mission to find the real Cassia. No matter the price or the legality, Orion had to know what kind of weapon he had welcomed into his house. The quiet caregiver was either his last hope for salvation or the most meticulously patient assassination plot he had ever seen. Orion needed answers, and his need was urgent. The paranoia was no longer an act. It felt like a sharpened blade pressed firmly against his own throat, and Cassia's was the only hand on the hilt. The investigation was like staring into a void. Even Marcus, who was built like an armored vehicle and had the eyes of a man who buries secrets, looked drained when he talked about her. Sir, on paper, she is perfect. The background checks, the official certifications, the references, they all cleared without a single issue, Marcus reported. But when we accessed our deeper sources, her profile disintegrated into meaningless digital noise. She exists precisely where she is meant to, and absolutely nowhere else. Orion sat in the darkness, watching the city lights from his penthouse blur into a hazy gray void. So the records are classified. Worse than that, sir. They are erased. This is a total wipe, Marcus clarified. It's as though she did not exist until 3 years ago, right when she signed up for a nanny training program. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. The only organization with that kind of power is— I know who has that power, Marcus. Dig again. Find something real. I do not care if you have to torch every server in the building to find a single fingerprint that doesn't fit the narrative. Find the real woman, Orion ordered. He never trusted anything that was flawless. A perfect paper trail was a guarantee of a forgery. A clever lie was always imperfect. This was unnervingly precise. He began to watch her himself, constantly. He went beyond the simple video feed, accessing the high-definition, sound-isolated streams from the compound's private network. The nanny camera became his tactical display, where he dissected her behavior, hunting for a single mistake. The first clue to the deception was hidden inside a child's toy. Orion's daughter, Ara, had a stuffed lion, tattered and adored. Cassia was folding clothes in Ara's room, humming a quiet, simple melody. She picked up the stuffed animal, smoothing down its worn fur. Her motions were smooth and methodical, until suddenly they were not. Her thumb pressed deep into the stuffed lion's left eye socket. There was a flicker of a pause. Then her fingers moved with the speed and precision of a surgical instrument. She did not rip the toy open. She identified a flaw in the seam, worked a nail under the thread, and pulled free a plastic disc the size of a pinhead. It was an active military satellite tracker, transmitting its location, hidden with incredible skill. Cassia did not flinch. The melody she was humming did not falter. She simply crushed the device between her index finger and middle finger with a soft, final snap, and dropped the dust-like remains into the deep pocket of her jeans. Then she went right back to folding a tiny pink shirt. Orion leaned forward in his office chair, the rich leather making a faint sound. The air rushed out of his lungs. Her action was not one of defense. It was pure routine. She had not been shocked by the discovery of the tracker. She had simply responded to the need for its immediate elimination. This meant she either knew it was there, or she possessed the training to check for it in exactly that way. He found her in the kitchen later that evening. She always insisted on cooking plain, wholesome food, turning away the compound's professional chefs. He decided it was time to make his move. The lion appears to have lost some of its filling, Orion remarked, leaning against the chilly granite countertop. Cassia did not glance up from her work with the vegetables. The blade in her hand was thin, like a razor, and it moved with a dangerous precision. Ara is very rough with her toys. We repaired him. Did you happen to find anything of interest inside? The knife stopped in mid-air, a single millimeter from the cutting board. It was the only indication that his words had landed. Only some cheap polyester fiber, she responded, her voice devoid of any emotion. They do not make them the way they used to. Orion held her stare. He felt that familiar surge of adrenaline, the cold excitement he usually saved for a high-stakes negotiation. He was bargaining with a woman about a stuffed animal, and she was clearly in control. Sometimes the smallest things carry the most weight, Cassia. One tiny piece of dust can completely obstruct your view. She began chopping again, the cadence quick and relentless. Only if you let it, she said simply. He walked out of the kitchen, unable to erase the image of her crushing the tracker from his thoughts. In that moment, he understood the security checks had been a farce. She had not just passed them, she had likely orchestrated them. The threat from Hydra was escalating. They were using intelligence collected over the last year, attacking weak points in his supply chain and hitting his secondary properties. The compound was in a state of high alert. The guards were jumpy, their uniforms dark with sweat. One night, a sound tore through the silence. It was not a warning shot. It was a sustained burst of automatic gunfire, originating roughly half a mile from the perimeter. The entire staff scrambled. Guards rushed to their stations. Orion raced toward the control room with his pistol drawn, but he stopped short outside Ara's bedroom. He did not go inside. He just watched the monitor that was set into the corridor wall. Ara had woken up immediately. She was sitting up in her bed, wailing with the high, thin scream of a child who can feel a threat but cannot comprehend its meaning. Cassia was already next to the bed. She did not try to hide the noise. She did not tell Ara that it was just thunder or fireworks. She refused to lie. "Listen to that, Ara," Cassia said, her voice calm, low, and full of authority. "That is the sound of people being extremely loud outside, like when you stomp your feet." Ara sobbed and clutched her blanket. "I'm scared. It is just noise." "Noise is only a danger if it gets inside this room, and it cannot," Cassia continued. "Look at the wall. Is it moving? Is the ceiling about to fall?" "No. That is good. It is because the walls are very thick. The men who are making that noise are very busy. They are completing their task, and we are completing ours. Our task is to be quiet. We will stay in here, and we will wait for the quiet to return." "Can you feel your own heartbeat?" Cassia then placed the child's small hand flat against her own chest. "Mine is steady. Yours needs to slow down. Breathe with me." In the distance, the sound of the assault rifles grew more intense. A mechanical hurricane, yet Cassia maintained the rhythm, slow and deep. She had turned a brutal, terrifying event into a lesson on controlled breathing. She was teaching his daughter not to fear the chaos, but to mentally wall it off. Orion stood completely still, his blood turning to ice. Ordinary nannies would use distraction. They would use denial. Cassia used reality itself as a weapon, forging the child's terror into disciplined focus. This was not a method from any childcare manual. This was operational stress conditioning. Marcus delivered his second report 3 days later. The summary was stark. "Sir, the files we located were decoys. We traced the server origin back to a decommissioned intelligence facility in Eastern Europe. The facility was officially abandoned 7 years ago. The files were uploaded 6 months ago. It is a dead end, engineered to simulate a credible civilian identity." "Which means," Orion concluded, "someone is actively covering tracks that were already invisible." "They possess incredible resources, sir, not just money. This requires government-level skill in erasing people." Marcus swallowed, his anxiety showing. "We ran her image through every international black operations database we could access. We found no matches. She is a total ghost, sir, and that is the most dangerous discovery we have ever made." Orion dismissed him with a wave. He did not need his chief of security to state the obvious. Cassia was a ghost, a weapon perfected for deep infiltration, and she was living just 2 floors above him, playing dolls with his daughter. He had to test the blade for himself. The meeting would be in his private study. At midnight, he called for her under the pretense of organizing confidential files. The documents were, in reality, the core blueprints of the Lyra Syndicate's entire operation, including coded account books, logistical charts for illicit shipments, and emergency plans for extracting high-value personnel. He watched her hands as she handled the pages. Her face showed nothing, but her eyes were scanning the documents, drinking in the data like parched ground absorbs water. She was memorizing the information, not simply arranging it. Orion poured himself a glass of bourbon. He did not offer any to her. "Cassia, you grasp the fundamental principles of this household. We operate on loyalty, absolute loyalty." "I understand, Mr. Orion. Loyalty is not free. It demands time, work, and sometimes it costs the lives of those you care for." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Have you ever been forced to make a clean break? To cut out a rotten section before the decay spreads?" She neatly squared a pile of financial reports by tapping them on the desktop. "A clean cut will leave a scar," she said, "but it prevents the rot from consuming the rest." "And what if making that cut demands you give up something you consider essential, something you believed was fundamental to your identity?" Cassia finally looked up at him. Her eyes were hard, catching the low light from the study lamp. "Then it was not truly essential," she declared without any feeling. "Survival is the only thing that is fundamental." He almost smiled. She was not just discussing his business, she was giving him the core principle of a hardened operative. Good, because recently we have had leaks. He felt her questions like tiny drill bits, slow and methodical. They were boring into the stone of his secrets, searching for the pressure point. He searched her face for a single crack in her composure, a twitch of guilt around her lips that would confess everything. He found nothing. Her eyes were steady, a calm and deep ocean. Cassia's voice was simple and clear. They will not succeed, she stated. The rock is much harder than they imagine. He had cornered her with his words, ready for the accusation. But she answered with absolute certainty. Without saying it, she told him she knew his world of shadows better than his own soldiers did. His paranoia shifted into a new, dangerous shape. It became a calculated reliance. He knew he could not trust her, but he also knew he could not survive without her. Her skill was the last line of defense. She was the one thing that kept the chaos of the outside world from touching his daughter. This desperate need started to wear down the lines between employer and employee. He came back late one evening from a meeting that was more of an interrogation. It had been brutal but necessary. His hand was bruised and a cut marked his forearm. He found Cassia standing in the hallway, as if she had been waiting. She did not ask a single question. Her gaze went straight to the drying blood on his sleeve. "You need to clean that before it stains," she said. Her voice was completely neutral. He let her lead him into the large marble bathroom. From a hidden drawer he never knew existed, she retrieved a sterile medical kit and immediately began to treat his wound. Her hands worked with a detached, clinical skill. But her closeness was jarring. No one ever touched Orion without his express permission, and never with such casual confidence. "You are not bothered by blood," Orion observed, watching her deft movements. "It is little more than iron and water," Cassia answered, securing the bandage. "It always washes away." He grabbed her wrist before she could pull back. His grip was tight, a clear reminder of who was in control. "Who taught you these skills, Cassia?" She did not struggle against his hold. Her eyes met his directly, ignoring the hand that held her captive. "Life was my teacher, Mr. Orion. Life is a very messy business. You either learn to manage the mess or it will pull you under." He let go of her wrist. He recognized her answer was a lie, but it was a flawless one. It was philosophical and impossible to argue with. It revealed absolutely nothing about her. He was walking into a trap he had built himself. He had become dependent on her quiet strength, on the way she observed his violent empire and his own fear without flinching. She never offered him false praise. She just calculated the danger and adjusted her strategy. His internal battle was a constant war. The ruthless boss inside him screamed for her death. But the tired strategist knew he needed her skills. He increased the surveillance, adding more sensors to her room, hunting for one mistake. He was desperate for proof of her betrayal. He needed a reason to feel relief when he finally eliminated her. The proof he was looking for arrived as a small, encrypted packet of data. Marcus's team had intercepted it. It came from a cleverly modified charger for an electric toothbrush, plugged into an outlet in Cassia's private bathroom. The initial software could not make sense of the contents. It was protected by a sophisticated polyalphabetic substitution cipher, hidden beneath layers of heavy quantum encryption. Marcus was visibly frightened when he showed the tablet to Orion. "Sir," he said, "we needed help from our contacts at the National Security Agency just to identify the encryption type. This is not the work of some rival organization. This is the kind of technology only a major government uses." Orion read the translated text quickly. The language was cold, dry, and technical, not a personal message or a threat. It was a field report. Target stability is high. Physical closeness has been achieved. Vulnerability analysis is 40% finished. Standing by for the extraction signal. The location coordinates were locked. Redacted latitude-longitude. The coordinates identified a remote, abandoned freighter dock at the edge of the city. It was the perfect spot for a silent departure. Cassia was more than a simple danger. She was a lit fuse on a bomb. She had gotten close. She had analyzed his weaknesses. The dangerous fascination Orion had felt for her soured into a poisonous, deadly mistrust in a single moment. He felt that familiar cold steel pressing against his own throat. But this time, he knew precisely whose hand held the weapon. She was not just attacking his world. She was taking it apart from the inside, one piece at a time, starting with his daughter's favorite toy. Just then, the Hydra made their move. They were no longer attacking his supply lines. They launched a direct and powerful assault on the compound itself. The entire southern wall vanished in a massive explosion that shook the building to its core. This was not a quiet attempt to get inside. This was a full-blown siege. And Orion understood with a sickening certainty that the knowledge of that specific vulnerability, that structural weakness, could only have come from Cassia. The time for games was finished. The confrontation had finally arrived. Orion snatched the tablet with the coordinates, secured his ballistic vest, and raced for Ara's room. His mission was not to rescue Cassia, but to eliminate her. The air was thick with concrete dust that made it hard to breathe. The sound of sirens was a pointless whine, lost beneath the heavy, rhythmic beat of automatic gunfire. He moved quickly, staying low, running through hallways that had once felt completely safe. He reached the south corridor only to find it gone, replaced by a massive crater. He could hear shouting, the sickening, wet sounds of fighting up close, and the metallic smell of blood spray already mingling with the smoke. Ara's rooms were on the third floor. They were supposed to be secure, but maybe not secure enough if Cassia had left behind other traps. He held his pistol tightly. Loyalty was not on his mind. He was focused on bullet trajectories and managing the damage. The betrayal hurt, but it was a secondary concern. His main goal was to survive and to permanently remove the traitor. He got to the stairwell and bounded up the metal steps, taking them 3 at a time. The main power failed. Emergency lights cast a sick, green glow on the marble walls, making the entire place look like a scene from a nightmare. The heavy steel door to Ara's private rooms was sealed. Orion quickly entered the override code. The door hissed open. Inside, Cassia knelt beside the bed. 4-year-old Ara was quiet, clutching an old stuffed bear. Her eyes were wide, but she was not crying. Cassia showed no signs of panic. She was calm, professional. She had covered the child with a special blanket made of Kevlar. It was standard equipment for operating in dangerous areas, not something an ordinary nanny would own. She looked up at Orion, her face smudged with soot, completely untroubled by the gun aimed directly at her. "You took your time getting here," Cassia said. Her voice was flat and emotionless. There was no fear in it, and no apology. Orion kept the weapon level. "The coordinates, Cassia. The dock. The signal for your extraction." He covered the distance between them in 2 long steps. He struck her hard on the temple with the side of his gun, slamming her back against the wall. The Kevlar blanket shifted. Ara made a small, whimpering sound that was swallowed by the war raging outside. "Who are you working for?" Orion's voice was a low, dangerous growl. "Does it really matter at this point?" Cassia replied, without even flinching. Her breathing remained even, almost calm. "The south wall. You handed them the plans. I handed them the weakness," she corrected him, her tone sharp and brutal. "That was my mission. Infiltrate the target, assess its vulnerabilities, and exploit them." "And what about the report? Target stability high." "Was that report about me, Cassia? Was I your target?" A powerful explosion rocked the entire section of the building. A piece of the ceiling broke loose and hit Orion's shoulder. The building groaned under the strain. "At first, yes," she confessed. Her eyes were sharp, looking at something over his shoulder, not at him. The plan was a clean removal. Take down the Lyra Syndicate by cutting off its head. Then, a clean escape. "What made you change your mind?" he demanded, pushing the barrel of the gun harder into her skin, breaking the surface. "You did," she whispered. It was not dramatic, just a statement of fact. "And her." Her eyes darted toward Ara for a moment. Your world is a terrible place, Orion, but it is real. The world I came from was just a shadow, a complete lie. I watched how you protected her. I saw the man you hide beneath all that control and power. The door's alarm began to shriek. A quick series of contained explosions ripped apart the hallway outside. They were not trying to shoot the door open. They were using precise breaching charges. They are moving through the air vents on the second level, Cassia said suddenly, her voice snapping with authority. She was ignoring the weapon at her head. And the eastern emergency exit. This is a standard 3-point extraction plan for a high-value target. They did not come here to kill you. They are here to capture you. Orion paused. Her analysis was too detailed, too perfect. Her tactical assessment was instant and flawless. She spoke like a battlefield commander, not some overqualified nanny. How could you possibly know that? Because I was the one who trained their instructors, Cassia answered. With a sudden, expert move, she pushed his gun hand aside, disarming him without causing any harm. His pistol flipped once in the air before his reflexes allowed him to catch it. Her movements were too fast, too clean. The reality of her skill hit him like a physical blow. Take Ara to the panic room now, Orion commanded, instantly shifting his priorities. Staying alive was more important than getting revenge. He could deal with her later. But it was already too late. A team of 5 men in heavy black tactical armor burst through the shattered remains of the hallway door. They advanced with a quiet, coordinated precision. These were not common street thugs. They were true professionals, carrying silenced weapons and moving together like a single, deadly organism. Orion shot twice, aiming for the center of the closest man. The body armor stopped the bullets, but the force of the impact sent the soldier stumbling backward. Cassia did not waste her ammunition. She snatched a heavy bronze lamp from a table and threw it directly at the lead attacker's face shield, blinding him for a moment. Then she moved with a swift, fluid grace. She was not just fighting, she was systematically disabling them. She used a leg sweep on one, a sharp strike to a pressure point in another's throat, and took a knife from a fallen man, driving it expertly into the weak seam of the armor near the shoulder. Orion dealt with the remaining 3 with raw fury and strength. He used his surroundings as a weapon, smashing one man into the reinforced balcony glass. When another's helmet finally fractured from repeated blows, he emptied his entire magazine into the man's head. They moved as one, a terrifying dance of death they had never rehearsed. Orion saw the brutal economy in her actions, every motion designed for maximum harm. Her gaze identified dangers he had not yet perceived. She was a weapon of absolute efficiency. One operative, the final member of the first assault team, slipped around Orion's flank. He brought up a silenced pistol, aiming for the one spot Orion could not see. Cassia saw it all. She stood nearer to the single viable escape, an emergency vent she had marked earlier. It was a clean line to the outside, her pickup point, her path back to a life she knew. She turned away from it. Instead, she threw her body across the chamber, slamming into Orion and forcing him from the line of fire. A spray of quiet rounds chewed through the wall where his head had been seconds before, blasting them with pulverized drywall and stinging metal fragments. She landed in a roll, snatching his dropped P-320 from the floor, and placed 2 precise shots into the attacker's exposed neck, just below the helmet's seal. A profound quiet descended on the room, broken only by the sharp, ragged gasps of the 2 people left alive. Cassia remained on the ground, breathing heavily, the firearm held unwavering in her hand. Her mission, her flawless exit strategy, her entire meticulously built life, was now shattered. She had given up everything to save the very man she was sent to eliminate. She had actively chosen this world of violence and uncertainty. Orion gazed down at her, his expression not of desire or respect, but of a chilling comprehension. She did not merely endure his violent world. She had made a conscious decision to inhabit it, incinerating every bridge behind her. He extended a hand to her. It was slick with his own blood and the blood of the men they had just dispatched. She accepted it. The atmosphere was dense with the smells of cordite, exertion, and their shared battle. The compound's alarms continued to wail around them. More will come, Orion said, his hands reloading a magazine with the flawless ease of long practice. I know, Cassia answered, checking the ammunition in the weapon she now held. Her eyes were already sweeping the area, searching for the next defensible position. Where do I find the blueprints for the lower levels? The last vestiges of mistrust between them had evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard demands of survival. She had the power to take everything, and now she was asking for the keys to his fortress. Orion did not hesitate with questions. Trust had become a liability. Skill was the only thing that mattered. He moved to his desk and ripped a false covering from a hidden steel compartment. With a hiss of depressurized air, a panel slid open, revealing a ruggedized tactical tablet. He threw it to her. Sublevels 2 through 5. They are using the service tunnels. They broke through the secondary firewall 5 minutes ago. Cassia plucked the device from the air with one hand. Her eyes devoured the intricate layouts. The schematics were detailed, showing electrical conduits, ventilation systems, and critical defensive choke points. Her finger jabbed decisively at one location on the screen, a redundant junction of steam pipes near the central server core. The weak point is here, she said, her tone clinical and completely calm. It is structurally compromised. If they use thermal charges, it will bring down the primary support column for this entire section. We intercept them before they reach it. Orion gave a single, sharp nod. There was no argument. He picked up a heavy combat rifle, the weapon's weight a solid and known comfort. They advanced with purpose, not a panicked sprint, but the controlled, tactical pace of people who understood the geometry of a firefight. The hallway beyond the office was a scene of total carnage. Twisted steel, shattered composites, and the warm, coppery smell of blood covered every surface. Orion advanced like a battering ram, using overwhelming suppressive fire and raw force to clear his path. He was an engine of pure destructive power. Cassia was his opposite. She moved like a shadow, her footsteps silent, her actions precise. Where Orion fired a 3-round burst, she used a single shot aimed to sever the spinal cord or rupture a major artery, attacks designed to produce instant incapacitation. Her violence was measured. They arrived at the stairwell that led down. 2 Hydra soldiers were moving up, their attention fixed on securing the floors above. Orion started to lift his rifle. Cassia caught his arm, pulling him firmly back into the shadows of a deep doorway. Noise attracts more of them, she murmured, her voice a breath against his ear. Let them go by. We move down. We eliminate the leadership. He paused for a fraction of a second, a man unaccustomed to yielding command, but her reasoning was flawless. He let the weapon fall. He could feel the intense warmth coming off her, the physical manifestation of her coiled readiness. The heavy steps of the 2 soldiers pounded past their hiding spot, their presence unknown. The moment the sound began to recede, Cassia was already descending the stairs, taking them 3 at a time while staying tight to the darkest wall. The sublevels were a network of narrow, oppressive concrete passages built for machines, not for combat. The air grew colder down there, thick with the scent of ozone and machine lubricants. The quiet itself felt menacing, a void just waiting for the eruption of gunfire. Hydra's favorite ground, Orion commented as they rounded a sharp corner. Siege tactics and tunnel fighting are their specialties. I know their entire playbook, Cassia confirmed, her gaze locked on the thermal readings displayed on the tablet. They depend on saturation tactics and superior numbers. They will not anticipate a surgical strike. They located the last line of defense guarding the main server room. 4 heavily armed operatives were entrenched behind hastily built barricades of server equipment. Their voices, muffled but clear, came over their communicators as they discussed thermal charges and structural weaknesses. Orion tensed, preparing to assault them head-on. His instinct was to charge directly at the threat. Cassia stopped him once more, her hand clamping onto his tactical rig. Her grip was stronger this time, an unspoken order that superseded his own battle sense. She pointed upward at a ventilation shaft running above their barricade. It was far too small for Orion's large frame, designed only for maintenance drones, but it was perfectly sized for her. A distraction, she said simply, her eyes unwavering from the enemy encampment. You make a lot of noise and draw their fire. I will go over the top, cut their communications, and kill the lights. Then we eliminate them. Orion studied her face in the dim glow of the emergency lighting. She was not suggesting a course of action or asking for his input. She was assigning him a role. It was a stunning and complete reversal of their power dynamic. He felt an unexpected, sharp surge of excitement. It was the stark realization that he was no longer fighting alone. He was fighting alongside something just as deadly and just as strategic as himself. Fine, he bit out, accepting his new position in this fight. He then opened fire. A long, sustained blast from his rifle hammered into the server racks, filling the air with a shower of sparks and metal fragments. The Hydra soldiers responded instantly, concentrating all their firepower on Orion's position behind a concrete pillar, their focus completely fixed on the loud assault. As she predicted, their doctrine of saturation fire meant every weapon was trained on the single source of aggression. By then, Cassia had vanished. She had climbed the wall in complete silence, locating the recessed latch for the ventilation duct. She disappeared inside with the fluid, disturbing grace of a person purpose-built for infiltration, her body contorting to fit the confined passage. Within the pitch-black duct, she moved like flowing darkness, swift and silent. When she emerged behind the fortified agents, she did not draw her firearm. She used a specialized, retractable garrote wire, a tool Orion recognized from highly classified intelligence briefings. It was a weapon for silent, methodical execution. The work was fast, quiet, and absolutely brutal. The first two operatives were slumped lifeless over their weapons before their teammates even noticed that the communications had gone silent and the tactical lights had winked out. In that moment of confusion, Cassia had the third man's throat open. The fourth and final soldier spun around, firing blindly into the darkness, his discipline broken by the sudden, noiseless death of his entire squad. Orion used the opening, lunging out from cover to deliver a controlled, lethal burst of fire into the man's unprotected chest. And then it was done. The silence that came next was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Orion advanced cautiously into the room, stepping carefully over the bodies. He found Cassia standing over the last man, her breathing only slightly uneven. She was not marked by blood, only covered in the fine grime from the ventilation system. She was in control, a complete professional. She glanced up at him, her expression impossible to decipher. It held no victory and no regret, only the profound stillness of a task completed. The compound fell quiet. The shrill alarms in the distance wound down into a tired hum and then ceased entirely. The Hydra assault was broken. The command element was gone. Orion stood amidst the ruins of his sanctuary. The destruction was catastrophic. Security systems were destroyed and personnel losses were grievous, but he was alive. And his daughter, hidden away deep inside the panic room, was unharmed. He looked at Cassia. Light from a shattered overhead panel cast a glow on the fine layer of dust in her hair. In less than 10 minutes, she had systematically dismantled a professional military assault force, saved his life twice, and expertly navigated his most secret defenses. He no longer needed to question why she had stayed. He could see the answer in the professional way she held her weapon, in how her eyes continued to scan the exits even now, and in her sacrifice of a perfect escape back to her old life. She had willingly taken on the crushing weight of his world. He began walking toward her, his heavy boots grinding against broken floor tiles. He stopped a foot away, maintaining a distance that was close enough to be a threat, yet far enough to respect the lethal space they both required. "The mission," Orion said, his voice a low gravel. Tell me what your original orders were. The absolute truth. No more deception. Cassia held his gaze without flinching. My objective was to gain access, identify all vulnerabilities, and then wait for the signal to exploit them. The exploitation signal? He echoed, the words tasting like poison. Did you send it? I sent the first required check-in, she confessed, but the extraction point I established was a fake, a dead end designed to mislead my handlers. They would have anticipated my departure tonight during the attack. What they received instead was nothing. Just silence. And the bodies you left for them on the perimeter, she paused, adding with a flat, emotionless tone. I severed the connection for good. Orion processed her words. She had not simply had a change of heart. She had deliberately annihilated her own past in order to guarantee his future. By turning on her old agency, she had effectively signed her own death warrant. Orion needed to know why. He didn't want a poetic excuse. He demanded the cold, operational logic that governed his own world of calculated moves. Cassia simply shrugged as she holstered the gun she had borrowed. Your daughter required protection, she stated plainly. Real protection. The people you employed were profoundly incompetent, and your entire organization, Orion, is far too powerful to be brought down by cheap guns for hire and political spies. If it was ever going to collapse, it needed to happen on our own terms. It was a brilliant reframing of her betrayal. She wasn't justifying her actions with sentiment, but with stark necessity and superior capability. She had looked at his chaotic empire, saw the immense power within it, and decided it was an asset worth preserving, but only if she was the one controlling its foundational security. Orion released a long, measured breath. Termination had always been his first resort. It was simple, and it was absolute. Yet as he looked at her, he understood that executing Cassia would be like shattering the only perfect weapon he had ever held in his hands. It would mean destroying the only true shield he had ever found. You are now aware of everything, he said, motioning toward the destruction that surrounded them. Every single vulnerability, every hidden protocol, every blind spot that I have. You represent the most significant danger to the Lyra Syndicate. I am, she confirmed without hesitation, and I made the choice to defend it. He moved a step closer, erasing the space between them until the air grew heavy with the smell of gunpowder and unspoken promises of violence. In that case, you are no longer an employee, Orion announced, his gaze as cold and hard as steel. You are not my prisoner, and you are most definitely not a nanny anymore. He bent down, not to touch her, but to retrieve the tactical tablet from the floor where it had fallen from her grasp. He offered it back to her. The complex schematics of the compound were still glowing on the screen, lit by the unsteady emergency lights. The Hydra will recover and attack again. We need to completely rebuild the lower-level defenses before the sun rises. Show me where we begin. Cassia glanced from the digital display, then back up to his face. The transformation was officially complete. She had demonstrated her ability to endure the bloodshed, the constant threat, and the suffocating paranoia. She had proven she could manage it all. She touched the screen, highlighting the structural weaknesses around the main generator. We begin with the firewalls, both the physical ones and the digital network, she declared. And the chief of security is compromised. He was the one who led them right to us. I require his full access codes and an entire team that answers directly to my command for the restructuring. We start immediately. A cold, predatory smile stretched across Orion's lips. It contained no warmth at all, only a deep satisfaction. He had finally discovered his equal. She was not a lover and not a subordinate, but an essential force of nature, a new foundation for his world forged from steel and ice. Consider it done, partner. He pivoted and walked toward the command center, leaving her alone in the middle of the carnage. Cassia watched him depart, the heavy tablet resting in her hands. She stood within the ruins of his war, holding the blueprints to secure his entire future. The violence had earned her a position beside the throne. She did not glance back toward the escape route. She had found her home. The Lyra Syndicate's cleanup crew began to arrive, moving with a silent and unnerving efficiency. They swept across the basement floor like ghosts, their actions precise and almost respectful of the violence that had just taken place there. They communicated without words, relying instead on hand signals and low, coded hums as they meticulously erased every piece of evidence from the recent attack. The air was thick and sharp with the smell of ozone and discharged ammunition. Cassia paid no attention to the bodies, stepping over them as she made her way to the main server rack. Her former life had taught her a vital lesson, that complete destruction was simply the first necessary step before reconstruction. She had once been assigned to tear things down. Now, her assignment was to build something even stronger. The first priority was dealing with the security chief, Marcus. Orion did not have to speak the order aloud. The understanding had been forged between them in the chaos of gunfire. Loyalty had to be absolute. Marcus had broken that rule. He was already contained in a deep-level interrogation room, firmly bound to a heavy chair made of steel. Orion guided Cassia down a long, sterile white hallway. With every step they took, the air seemed to grow progressively colder. "He is aware of all the redundancies," Orion said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "The emergency dead drops, the shell corporations, every single thing that keeps this operation running." Cassia gave a single, sharp nod, her own expression entirely clinical. "I will need the access codes, and I need to understand the full pattern of his infiltration. Exactly how deep into our systems did the Hydra manage to get?" They stepped into the room. Marcus glanced up, his eyes filled with a mixture of terror and desperation. He saw Cassia, the woman he knew only as the Nanny, and let out a choked sound that was part scoff, part fearful defiance. "She is just a child," Marcus spat toward Orion. "You brought the domestic help down here to watch this?" Cassia approached him, completely ignoring his insult. She did not raise her voice or make any threats. She just reached forward and applied pressure to a very specific point just behind his collarbone. Marcus let out a sharp gasp, and his face was instantly covered in a sheen of sweat. It was not a violent strike, but a precisely targeted point of pressure, one that immediately compromised his lungs' ability to draw in a complete breath. "The Hydra's main contact," Cassia demanded, her voice low and perfectly steady. "I want the name and the location, right now." Marcus thrashed, his body straining against the thick restraints. He attempted to form words, but all he could produce was a wet, ragged cough. Orion leaned casually against the reinforced steel of the doorframe with his arms crossed, watching her display of controlled, methodical cruelty. The man's pain did not disturb him. He was carefully evaluating her technique. She worked quickly, far too quickly for an amateur. She was systematically taking apart Marcus's defenses, piece by piece, not with brute force, but with the precision of a surgeon. "The codes for the offshore account," Cassia pressed, adjusting her position slightly to apply more intense, focused pressure. "You have 60 seconds, Marcus, or you will spend the next week of your life desperately wishing you could return to this moment." That was all it took. Marcus broke. He spewed a frantic sequence of numbers and names, his confession pouring out in a desperate and fractured stream of words. Cassia listened intently, committing every single detail to her memory. She took no notes. She simply absorbed all of the information. When he was finished, panting and utterly defeated, she finally stepped away. She then looked toward Orion. Her question was unspoken, but perfectly clear. Should she dispose of him, or should he be imprisoned? Orion pushed himself off the wall. He did not even look at Marcus. His eyes were fixed on Cassia. "You are in charge of security now," he said, his words conferring upon her total authority. "Clean up your own messes." She did not hesitate for a second. She did not reach for a gun or a knife. Instead, she picked up a thin fiber optic cable from a discarded maintenance kit that lay on a nearby table. The end was swift and completely silent. It was a clean disposal. Orion waited until the heavy door had sealed shut behind them to speak again. "You did not flinch." "Flinching is inefficient," Cassia responded, already scrolling through the stolen access codes on the tablet. It wastes valuable time and resources. Our next step is to replace the entire internal communications network. Marcus left behind multiple back doors. She gave him no opportunity for emotional reflection or analysis. Her focus was pure, cold logic. Orion felt a brief flicker of something that felt almost like admiration, a feeling he quickly buried beneath the harsh reality of their circumstances. She was a weapon, and that weapon was now pointed inward, protecting him. The following 2 weeks became a whirlwind of new construction, thorough personnel vetting, and systematic purges. The Lyra compound was transformed into a fortress protected by another fortress. Cassia moved through its corridors wearing tactical pants and a simple black t-shirt, which had become the uniform of her command, not her former service. She almost never slept. On the rare occasions she did, it was on a cot set up near the communications center. Orion watched her constantly. He observed how the other members of the syndicate, all hardened men who dealt in intimidation and extreme violence, followed every one of her directions without a single question. She did not need to scream or make threats. She simply laid out the threat assessment, her proposed solution, and the consequences of failure with a chilling and undeniable clarity. They respected her because she never shied away from the blood. The most incredible aspect was the flawless transition she made between her different roles. One afternoon, Orion discovered her in the brightly decorated playroom, completely surrounded by plush toys and stacks of building blocks. Anna, his 4-year-old daughter, was sitting peacefully while Cassia carefully braided small, colorful ribbons into her hair. The entire scene was one of domestic tranquility, a deceptive and peaceful moment. The perimeter alarms located on the west wing are still far too sensitive, Orion said from the doorway, his powerful presence immediately sucking all the warmth from the room. Cassia finished the braid she was working on with a smooth, practiced knot before responding. They are calibrated to detect thermal variances smaller than a rat. The Hydra used stealth drones during their last assault. We will not be relying on a line-of-sight defense strategy again. She then offered a gentle smile to Anna. Are you ready for your story time, sweetie? Anna happily nodded, completely unaware that her nanny was simultaneously discussing high-level military-grade security protocols and their failures. Cassia then rose to her feet and looked straight at Orion. The change was instantaneous. All the warmth vanished from her eyes, replaced by the calculating coldness of a master strategist. I have also identified the source of the leak in our cash flow, Orion, she continued, her voice lowering to a conspiratorial pitch. It is the transport company located in Monaco. They skimmed 7% during the last quarter. I have already initiated a freeze on their accounts and rerouted all assets through the Cyprus Holding Company. The cleanup team is already on its way. Orion could only stare at her. The absolute ease with which she managed both the nurturing requirements of his daughter and the brutal necessities of his life was deeply unsettling. She was not merely playing a part, she was genuinely both of these people at once. You are terrifying, Orion stated, not as an insult, but as a profound assessment of her value to him. I told you that I could handle all of it, she countered simply. That promise included the soft parts as well as the hard parts. You severely underestimated my capacity. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. He had dedicated his entire adult life to building walls around himself, trusting no one, and expecting betrayal from every single direction. He had always believed that letting someone get close meant exposing a critical weakness. Cassia had just proven to him that sometimes letting the right person in means you are importing an impenetrable defense. That evening, Orion summoned her to his office at the top of the tower. He had made her a promise, and now he would deliver. But understand this. Power is the only thing that truly keeps you safe. What you are about to hear will change everything, so listen carefully. The room carried the scent of rich cognac and expensive leather. Far below, the city lights shimmered, a vast grid of enemies and assets. He poured 2 drinks, the liquid a deep amber color. She took the glass he offered. Her hand did not shake. The Hydra is wounded, but its heads will grow back, Orion stated, moving the ice in his glass. They will attack our new defenses. They are aware I have a new weapon. They are aware the game is different. Let them come, Cassia replied, her voice steady as she tasted the liquor. They will find the fortress sealed and the soldiers ready. Orion set his glass down on the gleaming wood of his desk. He reached for a heavy, leather-bound book, the original register for the Lyra Syndicate, holding decades of secrets, names, and wealth. This book represented his entire life, his legacy, and his single greatest weakness. He pushed the volume across the polished surface until it reached her. "This is not a job offer, Cassia," he said, his voice lowering to a gravelly tone that meant his words were law. "You destroyed your old life to protect mine. That makes you a target. You have nowhere else to go. To your former masters, you are a traitor, you are a loose end, or worse, a liability to be erased." "I know what I have become," she said, her tone flat and final. "Good," he replied, "because you are not a guest here. You are not a high-priced guard, and you are certainly not a babysitter." He leaned in, his gaze intense, capturing her complete focus. "You are the foundation of this entire building. You are my second in command. Every piece of information, every dollar, every person in this syndicate now passes through you. You will manage the intelligence. You will manage the money. You will manage who gets in and who does not." He nudged the ledger forward until its weight settled into her hands. It felt dense, real. It felt like the weight of a kingdom. "You have earned this position," Orion finished. "But be very clear about one thing. The loyalty you gave me tonight is not temporary. If you stray from that path, if you have any secret plans, the consequences will be swift and total. We are allies in this war, but it is my name on the door. Do you agree to these conditions?" Cassia let her fingers trace the leather cover of the massive book. The chilling truth of the situation washed over her completely. She had given up her autonomy in exchange for immense power. She had sacrificed her quiet life for absolute control. She was now part of a world defined by constant threat, where her only value was her ability to keep Orion alive and fighting. "I agree," she confirmed. Her voice was not victorious, just determined. She opened the heavy book, her finger tracing the first list of names, old allies, and possible threats. She slid the tactical tablet closer, beginning to compare the names in the ledger with the most recent financial statements. "The first problem to solve is the outstanding debt we owe the Vulov family," Cassia said, already deep in her analysis of the numbers. "It is far too large. We need to sell off the South American properties to free up cash and cut them off. That connection is a vulnerability we cannot allow." Orion observed her as she worked. She was already lost in the task, focused entirely on the machine of his empire, not the man who built it. She was examining his life's work with the detached, sharp eyes of both a forensic accountant and a general. He allowed himself another small smile, a dark, satisfied expression of a successful gamble. He had thought he needed someone to comfort him in his paranoia. Instead, he found someone who could wield his sword for him. Cassia sat there, drinking his expensive cognac, with the heart of his syndicate laid bare on the mahogany between them. She was now the designer of his security, the blade for his enemies, and the shield for his child. She did not just enter his dangerous world, she had seized a vital, structural part of its very core. She had claimed it for herself. The city night stretched on, a dark canvas of danger and potential, and for the first time in many years, Orion did not feel the need to check who was behind him. He had built an empire on violence and fear. Now he would command it with cold logic and brutal efficiency, with his silent queen working beside him.